Brain Tanning, an easy guide for the 21st century. And I've been studying Plains Indian material culture for some 60 years. I'm getting old. When you ask most people on the street today what the fur trade was all about, somewhere along the line they'll get back to the fact they think that it was all about the Rocky Mountain fur trade and the great rendezvous that were held and the quest for beaver. This trade ran from basically 1822 to 1840. When the last of the beaver declined, silk was replacing the beaver in Europe. And there were still mountain men working independently in the Rocky Mountains even after 1840, but it basically came to a climax then. This period of history lasted from 1822, like I said, to 1840, a period of about 18 years, which was simply an interval in the fur trade. Fur trade in the Rocky Mountains has been glamorized tremendously throughout the years. I'll read you a quote from Thoughts on the Mountain Man and the Fur Trade by Charles Hanson, who's at the Museum of the Fur Trade in Chardon, Nebraska. And he says, "The mountain man was certainly one of the most powerful and romantic figures in the American West. This is so much true that his story has sometimes become more folklore and legend than real history. He has been stereotyped, generalized, romanticized out of proportion to the role he actually played in westward expansion." Following the fur trade in the West, in recent years, there's been two major films on the Rocky Mountain fur trade. The one with Charlton Heston entitled The Mountain Man, and the second was made on the life history of Jeremiah Johnson, who went into the Rockies with his beloved Hawken rifle. There's been countless books written on the fur trade in the Rocky Mountains. And even today, there's a series entitled The Mountain Men on TV, although it really has nothing to do with what happened back in the 1800s. Following the Rocky Mountain fur trade, the buffalo hide trade came into being. Buffalo robes were in great demand in the East, not only for floor coverings, but for lap robes. People used them to keep warm when they were out in the weather in the wintertime in either their horse-drawn sleighs or their wagons. It was estimated that there were over somewhere between 50 and 60,000 buffalo on the plains at that time. Due to the demand for robes, the hide hunters went to the west on the plains and basically eliminated the entire buffalo herd in 40 years. All they wanted were the skins for the robes. They left the meat laying on the plains to rot or be eaten by coyotes, wolves, whatever. It wasn't until later, when the railroads acquired refrigerated cars, that the meat was able to be shipped to the great restaurants on the eastern seaboard. But by 1880, the last of the buffalo were gone except for a few that escaped into Canada. That period of history lasted basically 40 years. And so the first two combined fur trade efforts lasted about 58 years. However, we can go back to the 17th century and find that the French had come down out of Quebec and Montreal, settled in the Missouri Valley in their quest for the great furs and the wealth that they would possess. This period of history actually lasted prior or before 1764. At the time, the Missouri Valley area where we live today was the prime spot for both deerskins and furs. Nowhere in North America did more species exist in such great quantities. And so France, Spain, England, even Russia on the northwest coast, and the Dutch all sought to control this area. And finally, in 1755, the first European war broke out between France, Spain, and England. France was defeated in this war heavily. Under secret treaty, France granted Spain all areas west of the Mississippi, and England took control all areas east of the Mississippi. So the Mississippi was the great dividing line between Spain and England. This treaty was finally signed in 1762. In 1763, the lieutenant governor from France in New Orleans talked to Maxent, who was the leading fur trader there and who was also in charge of the militia, so he was quite wealthy. What Maxent wanted to do was to establish a fur post somewhere in upper Louisiana or in the Missouri Valley. And he went into business with Leclerc, Pierre Leclerc, or as they say in French, Pierre Leclerc. And he took his stepson along with him, Auguste Chateau. Maxent felt that if they could establish a fur post, they could accomplish two things. One, they hoped to get an alliance with the great Osage Nation that numbered some 10,000 people. The Osage Nation basically controlled all of Missouri today, as well as northern Arkansas, northeastern Oklahoma, and eastern Kansas. So they had great control and basically supplied, or would supply in the future, over 70% of the furs and skins coming in to St. Louis. This alliance, they hoped, would also help prevent any further aggression by the British in the western portion. The French used diplomacy in dealing with the Indians as opposed to the English, who used subjugation as a major policy. It was only through diplomacy that St. Louis was able to survive. I mean, let's face it, there were fewer than 100 people in St. Louis at this time, looking at countless Indian nations as well as the oceans with 10,000 people. So diplomacy was the key. In St. Louis in the early years, it was strictly a barter economy based upon primarily deerskins. There was no hard money. They didn't even have pockets to carry it in. So if you had something that I needed, and I had something that you needed, primarily in skins, we set a bargain. And this had to do with literally every need that the people had. One example was one of the early settlers, Joseph Rubidoux, who wanted a house built. It wasn't a large house, like 12 feet wide and 18 feet long, but that was typical of the time. So he arranged to have his house built, and he paid the man who built it in deer skins, a few beaver pelts, and since he was a shoemaker, he threw in 3 pairs of shoes. That's how he bought his house. Like I said, there were trade standards set up for everything. Henry Howe, the great historian in Ohio, as just another example, stated that while a muskrat skin was worth $0.25, and a raccoon skin was worth $0.50, a doe skin was worth $0.75, and the skin of the buck was worth the almighty dollar. They figured the average skin of a buck weighed about 2.5 pounds. And this is where the term buck for $1 came from. And 300 years later, we still use that term. You know, I'm a little short of a few bucks, can you loan me some? Everybody knows what that means. Why was buckskin so important? Why were deerskin so important? Well, because of their versatility, for one thing. They were fairly cool in the summer. They were warm in the winter because they had the ability to breathe. They had the ability to stretch, both in the elbows and the knees. And there was a great shortage of Euro-American clothing available. And even when it was very expensive because it had to be imported from Europe. According to Shoto's journal that he wrote in 1805, he stated that between 1772 and 1775, a very brief period in this history, there were 625,000 pounds of furs brought into St. Louis. 215,000 pounds were in brain tan leather, and another 133 pounds were in raw deer skins that still had the hair on. Those two totaled 343,000 pounds, which was more than half of the total furs brought in. One of the big things that happened and propelled the deerskin industry was France began using deerskin in their bookbinding industries. So you can just picture the French with their great libraries reading books with covers produced by the Osage Indians. The balance of the skins that were brought in consisted of raccoon, fox, beaver, buffalo hides, otter. But this gives you an idea of the quantity of skins that were being brought in. Between 1764 and 1803, some 32 Indian nations regularly visited St. Louis for parleys. These tribes came from just about everywhere you can think of. They came from Missouri, they came from Kansas and Iowa, Nebraska, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, and as far north as Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, and as far south as Tennessee and Mississippi. They normally came for about 2 weeks and brought their entire family with them, mothers and children as well as the men. They normally stayed about 2 weeks and literally ate St. Louis out of house and home. They actually had to import food just to keep up with what the Indians needed. In 1781, got a visitor. In 1781, 130 Indian tribes came to St. Louis. And that was a record for that time. 130 in 1 year. Now, these Indians who came, who provided the skins and furs, as a matter of protocol, all felt that they were entitled to gifts, which had nothing to do with the furs they were trading. These gifts were separate. And Spain spent an average of $8,000 to $30,000 a year, with an average amount of $13,000 in presents for the Indians, basically made up of trade goods. In Spain, there were many who complained that this was worthless and we were simply giving money away. But the lieutenant governors in St. Louis knew better. They knew they had to have the Indians for allies. And they also knew that it was far cheaper, even with these expenditures, to give the Indians gifts to keep them friendly, as opposed to building forts and paying the soldiers. And so they had no real alternative. They had to have the Indians as allies. Now, the deerskin trade and the use of deerskins was not only in St. Louis and surrounding areas like Kaskaskia, across the river in Peoria and Cahokia. The use of deerskins spread as far east as Virginia and Georgia. A quote from my book by Catherine Braun, from her book, From Deerskins and Duffels. She says, by 1741, Augusta, Georgia, was, according to one rosy report, thriving prodigiously. The rough little village was declared the most flourishing town in the province. Augusta's success was largely related to the growing popularity of tanned deerskins for clothing and other uses. We can also point to the fact that as soon as I get my page, Another example, and the pride in wearing brain tan deerskin was Daniel Boone and his wife Rebecca. While they lived in Kentucky, and Daniel represented Kentucky in the Virginia legislature, Rebecca always made sure he had his finest buckskin clothing when he attended the sessions. Most of this clothing was made for him by Indian friends. If we go back to the Revolutionary War, or the War for Independence, and this is from How to Make Historic American Costumes by Mary Evans. She says, during the early part of the Revolutionary War, a hunting shirt of buckskin or linen, breeches of buckskin and gaiters, a large brimmed hat, ruffled shirt, black stock was the field service dress recommended by General Washington. The final choice of color, which did not materialize until the war's end, resolved into a blue coat with red facings and buckskin breeches. Washington was pretty astute. He knew that the people already were wearing buckskin clothing, and it would be the prime uniform for them who were fighting in the field, except for the officers. In addition, Washington knew that finances were low to support the war, and it was easier to have the people wear what they were used to wearing as opposed for the government supplying them with clothing. So they wore their buckskin. During the Lewis and Clark expedition from 1804 to 1806, we will see that they also wore buckskin clothing, which is a seminar I'm going to give tomorrow morning. And we'll go in far greater detail on what they actually wore as opposed to what people think today. General Ashley, who led a militia or company of men in the War of 1812, referred to his men as the Buckskins because this is what everyone was wearing. So as you can see, buckskin and the deerskin trade played a vital role in early frontier history. The pair of pants that I'm wearing today are made from brain tan buckskin, which I made probably 40 years ago, and they're patterned after a pair that was made in St. Louis in 1840 that is in the Missouri History Museum on Skinker Boulevard under wraps. They still look as good today as they did back in the 1800s. Now we have plenty of time, and if you have any questions or comments, I'd be glad to hear them. Anyone? No? No questions? You do your beadwork? Yes. Yeah. 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 The beads on my moccasins, which I made many years ago, were given to me by a good friend of mine at the time, Bob Volker, whose wife was president of the American Indian Association in St. Louis. Bob was in his 70s at the time when he gave these to me. They were given to him by an old Arapaho, he told me. So they have to be over 100 years old. In fact, if you go to any sources today for beads, you'll very rarely find any size 16s that are on my moccasins. I couldn't no more do beadwork with size 16 beads today than I could fly a jet. They're so small. So anyway, I can wrap this up if you'd like, or we can go on if you have any other questions. I'll be happy to answer them.
So your pants are based on a pattern made here in St. Louis?
Yeah, they were made in St. Louis in 1840, according to the curator.
Is that pattern available anywhere?
The only way you're going to see this pattern is go to the Missouri History Collections Department on Skinker Boulevard, where they have all their major collections that aren't being used in the museum. But the curator was nice enough to allow me to come in and basically draw what was there and take a photo of them, which I appreciated very much. They were actually, she told me, sewn on a sewing machine. And this was in 1840. Yeah. The moccasins that I'm wearing were also a pair of Kiowa moccasins, and they date to 1840. And the moccasins alone took me about 6 months to make in my spare time. Yes, sir. How does it hold up in water?
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. When you take a raw deer skin and you remove the meat and the fat from the inside and the hair from the outside along with the epidermis, what you have when you tan it by using grains is a piece of white buckskin. If you smoke the skin, however, the chemicals in the smoke coats the fibers in the deer skin that holds them all together, and they become water resistant. They're not waterproof. Water will still run through these, and they can get soaking wet. And all I have to do is hang them over a chair and let them dry, and they're just as soft as when I made them. White buckskin won't do that. Okay. So for everyday wear, smoked buckskin is what you want to wear. Yeah. Yeah. Because if it isn't smoked, there's a glue substance in the skin that holds everything together. And that glue will set up and become stiff. You can still get it back to a soft state by manipulating it, but it won't dry soft on its own. That's another thing I'm going to get into tomorrow when we look at the clothing worn by Lewis and Clark.
That's what I was thinking. That's what I was talking about. I keep saying that Lewis and Clark used buckskin.
That's right.
They're out there pulling those boats in the house in the water.
Yes.
Just wondering how that's.
Exactly. It didn't work very well.
Okay.
Yes, sir. I'm having a hard time hearing you.
He's not going to be here tomorrow, and I want to, if you just kind of curious about
Oh.
your clothing or the clothing boots. I won't be here tomorrow, so I'm just.
Well, I can't. That's going to take a full hour.
Oh,
I'm going to be talking on. I'm going to be talking on Lewis and Clark, naked in the wilderness and living off the land. So there's two topics basically. One, what they wound up wearing, and two, what they wound up eating along the way. You see, And it will be far more detailed than today.
What did they wear when they left here? Were they wearing buckskin or were they wearing wolves? Or what were they wearing?
Well, the vast majority of the men leaving here were in the military and wore their military uniforms, especially when you had an Indian parley, to impress them with awe and the power of the new American government. But they didn't wear those every day, although they still wore out too. See, and they began trading for moccasins and buffalo robes less than 3 weeks out from St. Charles. Yes, yes, yes. But again, that's what they were used to wearing, and they knew they were going into the winter months. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
I guess that'll do it.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.